Asyle, the engineer and the island. Week 18, Day 1. Now that I finally have some ore, it's time for me to move out of the Stone Age and start doing some actual metallurgy. The first thing needed was a crucible to melt my metals in. Metallurgy is something I actually think about fairly often, so I already had a design in mind for the most efficient crucible I could make, which I got started on after my morning chores. I kind of wish I'd started this the other day, so the clay would have had time to dry, but I didn't really have the time with all the mining going on. Unlike a typical crucible, which is shaped like a cup, I made one with a tall, cylindrical body and a spout that comes out of the bottom, like a tall teapot. The height is to help separate the metal from the dross, which flows to the top, more easily. And the spout is not only to make the metal easier to pour while keeping it separate from the dross, but also to bubble gases up and into the metal from the bottom if I need to. This would ordinarily run the risk of the metal solidifying in the spout, if it weren't for the spout being cooked to the same temperature as the rest of the crucible. It occurred to me later that this could also be used in a limited capacity to separate different metals in an alloy. If you could get one to react with a certain gas, like oxygen or chlorine, but not the other, the resulting mineral might have a higher melting temperature, becoming dross that would crystallize at the top of the crucible. I tried to avoid making the crucible too high, though, because the heat will also weaken it, and there's no need to give it a high pressure head. I can make it taller later if I need to. I also needed a way to pull it out of the kiln, and I didn't have any tongs or oven mitts. I also wanted to have a lot of control over the crucible while still standing some distance away from it, so I gave it 4 ring-shaped handles, 2 near the top backside of the crucible, and 2 near the bottom. I coated a couple of sticks in clay to thread through the handles, so I can pick up the crucible and point and pour it easily. The best crucibles, like the ones I had at home, have graphite in them to make them stronger, more temperature resistant, and even a little bit electrically conductive for induction furnaces. But since I didn't have any graphite, I mixed a little charcoal into the clay instead, and hoped it wouldn't wreck it. I had to experiment a little with different ratios, and made several crucibles, anticipating that at least one of them was going to break in the intense heat. I took my time with these ones, because I wanted to minimize that chance. It took a couple of hours before I was ready to leave them out to dry for the day, again, taking my time. While I was messing with clay, I experimented with preparing some molds ahead of time. I've heard of sand casting metals, but also that the finer the sand is, the better the detail on whatever you're casting. So I played around with making impressions in dry clay powder, which worked pretty well, though it was crumbly. I got the idea to add just a little bit of powdered rosin to help the clay stick together, and it definitely helped, though I'm not sure what the rosin will do under extreme heat. The other method I was aware of for making molds, when you want really fine detail, is to use plaster of Paris, which is calcium sulfate. I can make that easily by mixing calcium carbonate sand, or crushed shells or coral, with sulfuric acid from the other leaching minerals. Again, thanks to rough science for that little factoid. I didn't need anything that detailed yet, but I decided to mix up some ahead of time anyway, as it'll probably need to dry a bit before I use it. Alternatively, I could probably just use lime and make something like concrete, though I'd be concerned about the heat and steam generated by the slaking reaction causing some damage to the mold. Another problem with plaster molds is that they're not reusable, but I think you can cook them and get the plaster back to make a new one. At the moment, I don't really have anything I specifically want to make out of metal, other than wire for my electrolysis rig and thin metal plates so I can start experimenting with electronics. I don't really have enough ore to make tools out of them. The electronics will be more useful to me. So for the moment, I just made my molds to be simple, flat plates, holding the sand inside a simple bamboo box. But to make wire, I was going to need something a bit more sophisticated. Normally, Wire is made by pulling hot metal out of a narrow hole in a process called drawing. It kind of reminds me of the spinnerets on a spider. The problem with this is that you have to get the temperature of the metal just right in order for this to work. Too hot, and the metal just dribbles off. Too cold, and it solidifies in the hole. What's more, I don't have anything that can measure temperature right now, especially none this high. Instead, I had the idea that I could control how hot such an apparatus would remain by controlling its size. Heat transfer is proportional to surface area, so I made a moderately wide tube out of clay to pour metals into, and tapered it to a fine tip, which I poked a small hole through for the metal to drip out of. I can make the hole bigger later with my drill if I need to, and if I'm careful. How high I fill the tube with liquid metal will determine how fast heat leaks out of it, and thus the temperature. Fill low and the metal stays hotter. Fill high and the metal gets colder by the time it reaches the nozzle. Once the metal comes leaking out of the nozzle, I'll need a surface for it to cool on, and from which the rest of the metal can be pulled out. So I made another clay cylinder and put it on an axle that I could rotate. As I turn it, any metal wire that starts to form on it will wrap around it and get pulled as I rotate. I even put spiral grooves in the surface to help the wire stay separated, and made a little indentation to catch the inevitable initial dribbling of metal. I stopped for lunch at this point before moving on to another critical aspect of metallurgical operations. I don't expect any of my minerals to melt in the solar kiln because I doubt it gets hot enough. Despite my best efforts, I was probably lucky to get it hot enough to fire pots at about 1000 Celsius. And while this is 10 times the boiling temperature of water, good for the distiller, it's not hot enough to make any of the ores I've got decompose. This means I'm going to need to cook my metals in a fire, and one of much more intense temperatures than I've created so far. Wood fire can burn at up to 2000 degrees Fahrenheit, but the reason you can't melt a piece of copper in a campfire is because the heat of the fire escapes before it can get the metal very hot. I'm hoping that my kilns can be used to hold that heat in long enough to melt some of the tougher ores, but instead of relying on wood fire exclusively for heat, I want to give it an added boost from sunlight. This means I need to modify my solar kiln so it'll still work with fire in it. The problem with this is that fire makes smoke, and the only place for the smoke to come out is through the little vents where the sunlight comes in, which would naturally start blocking the sunlight. The kiln needs a chimney through which the hot gases can escape, though this will take some of the heat away with it, which is bad. However, I have an idea to make this chimney spiral around the outside of the kiln to help keep the heat in, while also not interfering with the incoming sunlight, and promoting complete combustion of the fuels inside. The process of heating the metal ores will also drive off more sulfur from the minerals than what I've leached from them, producing sulfur dioxide in reaction with the air. However, by bubbling it through my existing sulfuric acid solution, I should be able to convert it into even more sulfuric acid. No waste, less pollution. So to start this process off, I climbed to the top of the solar kiln and carefully used my hand drill to put a hole in the top of it. Fortunately for me, knowing that I would need to make these modifications, I didn't start the solar kiln this morning, so it was still cool. I then spent most of the rest of the afternoon making the clay coiled tube around the outside of it, same way I did for the kitchen kiln, though I had to clean the whitewash off the outside of the kiln as I went to give the clay something to stick to. Wasn't helping much to keep the heat in anyway. I extended the tube all the way to the base of the kiln and left a piece of bamboo there to attach a hose for the bubbler. I spent my last hour of the day making a spare length of rubber hose and preparing a rubber membrane for another diaphragm pump, which I can plug into the hole at the bottom of the kiln where I was piping water in and out, and use it instead as a bellows to get the wood really hot, though the positioning of the vents and chimney will already channel air into the base of the fire quite a bit. For the time being, though, I started a small fire in the kiln for the night. to help gently dry out the ventilation coil overnight, in addition to firing my crucibles. I was quite messy from all the work with clay I did today, so I enjoyed my shower this evening before going to bed. Week 18, Day 2. Okay, time to start melting metal. I took my fired equipment out of the kiln in the morning and started it up, checking also on the spiral tube and sealing up any cracks I saw in it first. I then conducted my morning chores before assembling that diaphragm pump, loading my ore, my sulfuric acid, and most of my wood into the elevator, and heading to the top of the tower to get started. This is exciting. I've always wanted to be able to make my own metal parts at home, but I never seem to have the time or right equipment to do it properly. I decided to start with the heaviest ore first, because I suspected it's probably going to have the lowest melting temperatures. I came to this conclusion because mercury, the metal with the lowest melting temperature, is near the bottom of the periodic table, so the trend is that heavier metals tend to have lower melting temperatures. While I was pouring the ore powder into the crucible, I remembered that I was supposed to add some kind of flux to the ore to help soak up impurities, but I couldn't remember what compounds I was supposed to use, so I tried ashes and some crushed coral or lime. Fortunately for me, I was pretty close to the mark, as I remembered later that potash and lime are traditional fluxes. I basically surrounded the crucible with wood and lit it before lifting the floor back up into the kiln, though the addition of solar heat practically made the wood light itself, and adding air to the coals with my bellows only made it burn more furiously. I got kind of bored of pumping the bellows, and there was plenty of wind on top of the tower, so I stepped away for a moment to commandeer the spare pump turbine from the garden and set it up on the tower to run the bellows for me. I couldn't tell from peeking through the gaps in the kiln how much of the brightness of the coals was from the temperature or from the sunlight, but I made a rough guess that if the sunlight was adding enough energy to the kiln to raise it to about 1000 degrees Celsius, then the wood probably added enough energy to reach 2000 degrees Celsius, though perhaps less. I didn't know how long the metal needed to cook, so I gave it about an hour before checking on it, and in the meantime, I decided to make a proper respirator to protect me from breathing in any toxic vapors. First, I took a big wad of clay and stuck it on my face, holding my breath as I shaped it to fit snugly over my nose and mouth. I then coated the form in latex-soaked cloth scraps a few times, like paper mache, and set it aside to dry. I then got some spare paper and cloth, and after confirming that I could suck a little air through them, I folded the paper into a narrow accordion shape before wrapping it into a cylinder and stuffing it inside a short segment of bamboo that I drilled full of holes. I found that when I tried to breathe through it, the paper filter had a tendency to collapse, so I used some cord to tie the creases down to the walls of the tube. The larger surface area of the filter made it easier to breathe through than a flat sheet of paper. The outside of the tube I wrapped in a few layers of cloth to act as a larger particle filter, and in between them I added some fine charcoal powder to help absorb any unwanted chemicals from the air I'll be breathing. I have no idea what kinds of gases or vapors will come off of the ores when I start cooking them, but I'm most concerned about lead and mercury vapors being mixed in with the metals, so I added a second paper layer coated in sulfur powder. This should chemically bind to any metal vapors that make it through, effectively turning them back into the inert minerals they used to be. Finally, I drilled a hole through the partition on one side of the tube and covered it with a rubber membrane held down on only one side. This way, when I breathe in, it'll seal the tube closed and air will only be able to pass through the filter, and when I breathe out, the flap will be pushed open. Reminds me of how I was taught to treat a sucking chest wound during EMT training. I built 6 of these tubes, for redundancy and to make it easier to breathe, and when the mask was done setting, I attached them to the sides of the mask, tying them to a pair of rubber bands I laced into the mask to hold it to my face. Now that it's done, it looks surprisingly cool. The filters kind of remind me of the vents or grills you sometimes see on the cheeks of mechs or Gundam. By that time, the ore had almost certainly melted, and I went back to the tower to check on it. Not too surprisingly, the metal I got first was lead, probably an alloy of lead and silver, meaning the mineral I found was probably galena. As an aside, I held on to some of the larger crystals of each specimen in their native forms, because they were pretty and might have useful properties in that form. In this case, I knew galena could be used as a semiconductor for primitive radios, so I'm definitely going to put a label on that one. Although it can be toxic, the fact that I was able to produce lead is actually great news, because I can use it to create batteries with all the sulfuric acid I produced. However, I'd like to get the silver out of it first. I remember that in the past, they used to use air to refine silver, removing the lead by turning it into lead oxide. However, lead almost certainly makes up most of the alloy in the pot right now, and in a weird way, it's more valuable to me than silver at the moment. So I need to react the silver and use a gas other than oxygen. I considered my options. If I used sulfur dioxide from my sulfuric acid, I'd just turn the metal back into the minerals they used to be. If I used alcohol vapors, I'd be adding carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen to the mix, which would probably mostly cancel each other out or produce carbonate minerals. That left me with ammonia, which is hydrogen and nitrogen, and if I let a little air into the mix, the ammonia and air ought to burn to produce nitric oxide and water vapor, which will in turn react to form nitric acid, which should then react with some of the silver to produce silver nitrate, which could end up being very useful for other projects. It was a long shot, but I connected the pump to one of my bottles of distilled ammonia, setting it near the kiln so it would get hot and vaporize the ammonia with high temperatures and low pressures. Then, once I'd removed the crucible from the kiln and removed the slag with a stick, I inserted a clay plug and the rubber hose from the pump into the spout, so I could gently pump the ammonia vapor into the metal, being careful of splashing from bubbles in the molten metal, and to avoid breathing in toxic vapors by standing upwind of the crucible. Chemistry is not my forte, so I wasn't entirely sure if this would work, or produce a bunch of useless dross that I would have to refine again. However, as the alloy cooled, I noticed a hot, translucent liquid floating in small puddles on top of the liquid lead along with the dross, which I could only assume was the silver nitrate. What other compounds could possibly condense or liquefy on something so hot? Once the lead had solidified again, I carefully decanted the hot silver nitrate into a pot, where it eventually solidified into white crystals. I had to melt the lead again, after which I poured it into the prepared mold, which I'd put in the furnace with the crucible to keep it warm and help the lead flow into the mold without solidifying prematurely, producing several flat plates. I now have two extremely useful materials. The next heaviest ore I tried also melted for the most part, though it took a little longer. Once it did, however, its orangey color told me immediately that it was copper. I can hardly contain myself. Because copper is most useful to me as wire, I poured it into my wire pulling machine instead of a mold. It took a couple of tries to get it right, and some of the metal spilled onto the ground, which I had to wait to cool before remelting. However, in time, I managed to find the optimal height in the column for temperature, and the right speed on the drum to pull the wire without breaking it. The result wasn't perfect, often having areas where one section of wire was a little thicker than another, but overall I couldn't be more excited, because this means I have a real shot at making some electronics. I stopped for a late lunch after this, leaving the third heaviest ore to melt unsupervised, but when I came back, It hadn't quite melted yet, telling me I was probably reaching the peak temperature this kiln could produce. This was the goldish iron pyrite, and while I managed to drive off some more sulfur, the ore instead turned into a crusty sponge of rust from air getting into it. However, I'm not displeased with this result either, as getting rid of the sulfur was an important step in refining it. I started heating the ore up again, and once I'd gotten the crucible red hot, I tried carefully blowing ethanol vapor into it, hoping the gas wouldn't light in the tube and explode or something. Ethanol is mostly hydrogen and carbon, and I hoped it would remove a lot of the remaining oxygen in the ore. This probably helped, but not in any capacity that I could detect, probably because it just couldn't get hot enough in there to actually melt the iron. What I ended up with instead was a red-hot lump of crusty ore, some of which has probably melted into iron, but not entirely. This isn't too surprising though, because the way iron is traditionally refined is that they would make a huge stack of layered iron ore and coal, and let it cook down for days. I'm still not upset about it though, because I know there are other ways I can refine this rust later. This also destroyed my crucible, so it's a good thing I made extras. After giving the iron a few extra hours of cooking, and determining that it wasn't going to get any better, I gave it a rest, and tried the lightest ore before the sun went down. To my surprise, this one melted extremely easily, and I repeated the trick I tried on the iron ore here, removing any oxygen from the metal with ethanol. This time it worked much more effectively, resulting in cast plates of a white silvery metal. I wasn't able to identify it at first, but I remember a minor and imprecise trick for identifying tin. When you bend it, it makes a sound, which is where we get the term tinny in reference to sound quality. To my surprise, it did not make a sound, proving that it probably wasn't tin, and my suspicion was incorrect. I'll have to conduct some other tests later to confirm what kind of metal this is. Other than that and the iron, my smelting project has been a massive success. However, there was still work to be done at the end of the day in cleaning up after myself. Specifically, my bubbler didn't just catch sulfuric acid, but also a little methanol and creosote from the wood smoke, in spite of my best efforts to encourage complete combustion of the fuel. I made a note to build a large fractional distiller for the kiln to prevent this from happening in the future, or to allow me to produce methanol in bulk for fuel. There was also a mess of unidentifiable mixed hydrocarbons in my pot that I had to clean up. The creosote oil at least was easy to decant off the top of the solution, though it wasn't exactly as I imagined it, more of a yellow oil than a black tar, and it smells like that liquid smoke used for imparting flavors to meats. It kind of makes me hungry, but I always remembered creosote as being carcinogenic, so there's no way I'm going to give it a taste. That's why I always avoided smoked meats at home anyway. But the more I think about it, there's no way the FDA would let people sell liquid cancer as a food additive, so maybe there's a difference between organic wood creosote and mineral coal creosote. Whatever the case, the methanol in the solution is going to be harder to extract, since it dissolves in water and is mixed together with the sulfuric acid. Like I said, I couldn't boil the compounds to separate them, otherwise they might have made new stuff that I didn't want, so I had to rely on lowering the pressure instead. I took my solution to the lab and used my bellows pump and turbine to create a slight vacuum inside the storage pot, which I then passed into the distilling rig to make sure all the compounds got separated. I'll leave that to run overnight. Week 18, Day 3. When I got up in the morning, I found that my distilling rig had made an extremely concentrated form of the sulfuric acid that must have eaten through the hose and pump sometime last night. The entire lab had a sharp, pungent smell about it. I carefully poured the acid into into a pot of water to dilute it and make it more stable, remembering that mixing water and acid produces a lot of heat, and if I poured the water into the acid, it wouldn't have been able to absorb the heat as effectively and would instead boil or crack the pot containing it. Once that little crisis was averted, I did my morning chores and started working on fixing that little mistake, preparing the latex for another pump and hose. Then I got started on that fractionating column for the solar kiln. I mixed up some more clay and prepared several cylindrical pots which will stack on top of each other. I made them a little concave on the bottom and sloped to one side towards a spigot where the distilled vapor will come out. I angled the spigot downward so that any vapor still caught in it would continue rising to the top of the tower or get bubbled into a pot of water to capture anything that might come out. Finally, I put a little hole in the bottom of the pots near the top of the slope for gases to pass into from below, giving the hole a sort of roof to keep sand or whatever particles I used for the distillation surface from plugging it up. I made several of these and left them out to dry. It took me a couple of hours. I then decided to build one more wind turbine to keep permanently at the top of the solar tower, so I don't have to keep borrowing the one from the garden. Then I had lunch. Now it's time to start having fun with those metals. The absolutely first thing I did was hook up my wire to the Van de Graff generators, dipping each piece in latex a few times and drying them so they would be electrically insulated. I then restarted my electrolysis rig, and this time I could really see the bubbles starting to form on the electrodes. If I'm going to be messing around with electronics though, I'm going to need a lot more metal and a lot more electricity. Ideally, a source with more current and less voltage, if I want this electrolysis process to go faster. Therefore, I decided that the metal I needed to start electroplating first was actually my big wad of iron. As useful as something like an iron axe head would be, and as annoying as it is sometimes to have to keep replacing my stone ones, stones are cheap and plentiful, and the iron is more valuable to me for its electrical and magnetic properties than its mechanical strength. So my plan is to make it into plates and use them to build an honest-to-goodness electric generator. This is going to take a while, and I'm going to need a lot more copper to make the wire coils for it, so that'll be my next priority. I also started fiddling with the lead plates I made, dipping them in sulfuric acid, and driving an electrolytic reaction between them, building up black lead oxide on one plate and pure silvery lead on the other. However, I recognized that this would never allow me to generate more electricity than I put into it, so it wouldn't be helpful for speeding up the electrolysis without a better generator. I thought it would also be helpful if I could make the plates smaller and thinner, so they could store more charge between them, and I considered electroplating lead battery plates first, instead of the iron ones for the generator. But I'll only need a battery for devices that need to operate remotely, and I have no such machinery yet. For the moment, I just used the plates I had to make a simple battery, since I had no other use for the lead and may need a battery later, building a bamboo box to support the battery and lining it with clay that I'll fire to make waterproof tomorrow. I spent the last couple of hours of my day fiddling with my light, silvery mystery metal, measuring things like its density and tensile strength. It was quite reactive with my acids and bases, and when I exposed it to fire, it produced a pretty blue-green flame, but even my generally encyclopedic knowledge of science and chemistry has limits. I know that potassium burns with a purple flame, and copper produces a green flame, but I don't know what metals burn with a blue-green flame. It also left a white powder behind that I couldn't identify either, though I found it a bit surprising since I would have expected most metal oxides to be a dark color, like rust and tarnish. As I said before, chemistry was never my strongest subject. Even everything I've done up till now has been the most basic of basics. At least I know it's not magnesium, because it would have burned aggressively in air, or even water. I wrote down the results of my studies in metallurgy and mineralogy today, before wrapping up for the evening and getting ready for bed. Week 18, Day 4. I put the clay parts I built yesterday into the solar kiln early in the morning, before conducting my morning chores, which reminded me that I still hadn't finished tiling the roof of the workshop, so I decided to finish that before it got too hot outside. I then finished building the hose and pump I started yesterday. I'm starting to run out of things to do again, which I suppose is a good thing in some ways, but I don't want to stop moving forward. There was a lot of silica-based minerals left behind from the ore centrifuging process, including a lot of the olivine I was looking for to decorate the solar tower, which the centrifuge was thankfully able to winnow from the other silicates. I didn't really consider it a practical source of ore, because, if memory serves, it's mostly magnesium and silica, with traces of nickel, which are responsible for making it green. This actually contributed a little to helping me separate the individual crystals by color, giving me green and yellow powders that I could use as pigments. It wasn't a lot though, maybe a liter or so of powder, not enough to cover the tower by a long shot. So, as much as I hate it, it looks like the most efficient way to use this powder will be to make more tiles and spread the powder thin on them. I guess it's about time I got back to that practice, I suppose. If I make the large 1/6 of a square foot tiles, and the tower has a surface area of about 377 square feet, I'll need about 2,262 tiles, or a little over 4 90 square foot batches. At a tiling rate of 5 seconds per tile, it should only take me a little over 3 hours to tile the whole tower. Though that doesn't factor in how often I'll need to move the ladder, so it'll probably be closer to 6 hours, or an all-day job. So I spent a couple of hours batching more tiles, and leaving them out in the sun to dry before having lunch, though I still didn't have enough olivine to cover more than 10 square meters. Not quite a third of my tiles, so I'll just have to dip them in pigment and fire them with it later. I found myself with some downtime again after lunch, so I made the other 2 batches of tile before the chime finally rang, indicating that the fractionating column parts were done cooking. Once they'd cooled, I began assembly right next to the solar kiln, sealing the stacks together with latex so they would be solid and airtight, but could still be disassembled if need be. I filled each level with pieces of pot shards from the many pots that have cracked, broken, or failed during firing over the months. I didn't want to necessarily use sand yet because that may create too much surface for condensation, and all the vapors might end up condensing at the bottom of the distiller. I made sure that the bubbler pipe I made reached into the bottom of the column, reinforcing it a little with clay and grout, and finally, I tied some small pots to the bottom of each spigot, like a tree tap. Overall, I'm really pleased with the resulting device, not only for its functionality, but for its appearance. It looks like some esoteric piece of equipment that would be found in one of my favorite puzzle games, like Voyage to the Moon or Quern, and it seems to fit nicely aesthetically with the solar kiln. I still had some time to kill at the end of the day, and I decided that I wanted some music, but I only had enough time to build a new reel before it was time to start getting ready for bed. I made sure to fire the 1 batch of colored tiles I had before going down for the night. Week 18, Day 5. After my morning chores, I decided to get started on some of the tiling before it got too hot out, making sure to start on the north side of the tower so I could do the rest of my tiling in the shade as the sun moved throughout the day. I started by marking out the pattern I wanted on the tower's surface with charcoal. I wanted to arrange the tiles such that they were raised higher in some places than in others, to create a texture that gives the appearance of layered leaves on the sides of the tower, roughly triangular in shape, like the tiles. I also took advantage of the fact that the olivine powders I've been using were not uniformly the same color, allowing me to create a color gradient that became darker towards the edges of the leaves, and lighter or more yellow toward the base, where the next layer of leaves would start, to continue to create the illusion of different layers of foliage. It's still kind of stylized, but I like it a lot. The additional planning and separation of the colors caused this to take longer than I expected, so around the time I finished my first round of tiles, it was time for lunch. I can't really do much with the tiles until I get more olivine. I might as well get other minerals while I'm at it, so I'm going to make next week another mining week. Until then, though, I'm kind of out of ideas for what to do in the meantime. Mining is kind of back-breaking work, so I'd like to think a little bit about ways I could make it easier on myself. Sure would help if I had some explosives to get the mineral veins that are deeper inside the rock, compared to the surface stuff I've mostly been scraping off. I could maybe make gunpowder from charcoal, the sulfur deposits at the peak of the island, and potassium nitrate from the decomposition of fecal material, but it wouldn't be very powerful. If I had nitric acid, though, I could make all sorts of explosive compounds. The only problem is, the simplest way for me to make nitric acid at the moment requires electricity, and I don't really want to stop making metal plates for the dynamo. Besides, I wouldn't have enough prepared by next week to get very far anyway. I looked around for additional things to do, and saw that I've accumulated a fair amount of varnish, so I just spent the rest of the afternoon looking around the base for anything made of wood that I could coat with it, before having dinner and going to bed. Week 18, Day 6. With nothing major left on my to-do list, I decided to just take a 2-day weekend like I used to. It's so weird that, with all the comforts of civilization, I never seem to have as much time to do things as I do now. So, after my morning chores, I spent most of the day making a new song for the music machine. Again, great way to soak up extra time in an easy and creative way. I sat my little doll next to me as I worked. At home, I pretended that Yadi's special interest was music, partly to practice for the very likely possibility that my kids won't have the same interests as me, but also as something we could enjoy together, which became our little tradition every time I had to fold my laundry. In practicing for taking interest in my kids' interests, it kind of led me to explore and enjoy music in a deeper fashion for my own personal enjoyment. I guess this has always been my pattern with my family members. I used to join Mom in singing when she would practice for the worship services at church, assimilating her love for it by just enjoying doing it with her. Eventually I got so good that she invited me to join the worship team too. I think I didn't want to lose that experience, knowing I would have to move away someday, and not having a reason anymore. I wanted to be able to share that experience with my kids, so I imagined giving that joy to Yadi. Anyway, I took a break for lunch before finishing the song, specifically a tropical cover of Daydreamer by Megan Echo, which I consider my unofficial theme tune, and spent the remainder of the day writing and drawing, though it reminded me that I should probably make a new batch of paper soon. Week 18, Day 7. Now it's the actual Sabbath, and after having the day off yesterday, it feels kind of weird to have to take the day off again, like it really bucks my routine. There's a degree to which I enjoy having time off, but there's also a degree to which I don't like it. I specifically don't enjoy being idle, and I think the reason I liked having time off at home was so I could work on crazy projects like the ones I'm making here, though something else always stopped me from going through with them, and I would end up sitting around and wasting time watching TV instead. Not necessarily a bad thing, because I at least got some together time with Nat, but I think after a while it started becoming a rut. So, to feel like I was doing something a bit more useful today, I started a batch of paper after my morning chores, before making another reel and program for the music machine, which took me the rest of the day. This time I made I Never Forget by Death Row, and it's kind of a tricky business, because most of the music I like to listen to in my spare time is chiptunes, which takes some creative reinterpretation to play on extremely analog instruments. I suppose it was an appropriate tune, since I was feeling a little more somber today. I guess I don't have anything else to report, so I'll go to bed now. Insert funny film reference with blooper reel in it here. Now that I finally have some ore. Please, sir, can I have some ore? This would ordinarily run the risk of the metal solidifying in the spout if it weren't for the fact that the spout being cooked to the same temperature as the rest of the crucible. Typos. Pause. It occurred to me later that this could also used, hold on, at about 1000 centigrade. Celsius, whatever. At about 1000 Celsius. But I made a rough guess that if the sunlight was adding enough energy to the kiln to raise it to about 1000 degrees Celsius, and the wood probably added... I think there's a typo in here. Okay, back to it. And it smells like that liquid smoke used for imparting flavors to metals. Metals? Why would you want to flavor metals? I can't read, apparently. I put the clay parts I built yesterday into the solar kiln early the morning. I put the clay parts I built yesterday into the solar kiln early in the morning. There's a typo. Resume. There's no way that sounds right. I want to arrange the tiles such that they were... I think there's another typo in there. Tense. Resume. Now, where was I? Hey there, thanks for listening all the way to the end. Now that I've finally got some metals, delicious copper, I can really put my engineering knowledge to work. So, if you want to see what I make next, you can press the subscribe and bell buttons at the bottom of the video as soon as they're cast. Here's hoping I don't break the mold, though. Now, although I'm not trying to make money off of these videos, it would still help me out more than anything else if you could share this video with someone who you think would enjoy it. And since you apparently enjoyed it enough to watch it this far in, you can press the like button to say so. It'd be really metal of you. There's also a dislike button you can press if you didn't like the video, but there's no need to bellow at me. Can't you just let it go? Or I could just keep throwing puns at you until you take it back. I got everything here but the kitchen sink. Someone's gonna have to call the coppers. Also, if you want to chat about your own stories or perspectives on the episode, maybe about a time you tried your hand at metallurgy or blacksmithing, and any projects you learned from or are particularly proud of, feel free to share them in the comments section below. I genuinely love to hear them, and I'm always open to suggestions or corrections. That said, thanks again for listening, and hope to see you here again next week.